Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your willingness to come, especially so early as we begin to talk about dementia for the next two sessions. About 10:30, we'll be finished with the second one, and then we will talk about two sessions concerning grief so that we continue that. But there is a lot of grief in dementia because a person is there, but in some cases they're not there, yet they are there. And so there's that anticipated loss where a person has to deal with that. You have before you some 10 things concerning dementia, and so we'll begin to look at those, and these are true and false. If you'll go to the next slide, fellas. And I'll begin by saying this illness became personal when on Thursday, June the 9th, 2016 at 5:30 in the afternoon, my cell phone rang, and it was the Dr. Marissa Nadelson from the UAB Kirkland Clinic, a neurologist. And she said, after studying the most recent MRI from your mother, Dot Williams, and comparing it with the one that was taken 3 years ago, I see significant shrinkage of the brain. The diagnosis of dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. She died 39 months later, and in 2019. And so one of the things that I continue to try to do is to learn more about this dreaded disease, to honor her, and to be able to be of help to others with folks just like her. So here are some true and false, and we'll think about these and talk about these. Number one, the word Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's, however you want to say it, is of German origin. It means demented or out of mind. The answer is false. This disease portion of dementia is named after Dr. Alois Alzheimer. In 1901, he was a neurologist, a pathologist, and a psychiatrist. He began to treat a patient by the name of Augusta de Tour, who had some mind issues. And when she died in 1906, he took her brain with the family's consent and began to examine it. It was like Swiss cheese. The cells of the brain were tied up in knots like a rope. It contained amyloid and tau plaque in it. And in 1907, whenever he was giving the information about this to a convention, they named it after him, Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's disease. Next, fellas. Number two, in any given audience, 30% of the people in the audience will one day experience dementia or have someone they love develop dementia. The answer is false. Dr. David Hutchins in the Boston area, but he has land and a farm over in Mississippi, says that in any given audience, even like this one, 53% of the people in the audience will either themselves one day have dementia or have someone they know that will develop dementia. So it's not saying that half of all the people here will have it, but you either know someone or you have a family member or someone that you do know. So it's not half of all of us. There's 30 here. It's not saying all 15 is going to have it, but we'll know someone. Listen to me just say, by the raising of hands, how many of you either have a family member or know someone who has dementia? Raise your hand. Well, there is a good half, if not more, in that regard. And so we need to keep that in mind. Next, fellas, number three. Dementia studies show that if a family member has Alzheimer's disease, there's a 50% chance that they will develop this disease as well. The answer is false, yet there's something about this disease that suggests that if it's in your family, depending upon how close it is to your family, is it a parent or is it a sibling as opposed to a third cousin, then there is a greater chance if it's a parent or a sibling, there's a greater chance of it being something in your genes as opposed to the third cousin. This is my wife's greatest fear because her great-grandmother at age 85, her grandmother at age 75, notice the progression, her mother at age 65, all had dementia. And so her hope is that she has a lot of her dad's Cherokee blood in him. John Robertson was the minister at Brilliant for some years. That's my father-in-law. And he was 25% Cherokee Indian. Cherokee Indians only have a 12% chance of developing dementia. So there's something to be said for that. Yes? No. Thank you for saying that. Thank you. I meant to read this at the beginning. Dementia describes the symptoms that affect people's thinking and the ability to do daily tasks. Alzheimer's disease is an accumulation of proteins that kill brain cells and is the biology that causes the dementia. Think of it this way. Dementia is the family name and Alzheimer's is the firstborn son, if you can think of it that way. My point is, there's 70 to 80 different kinds of dementia, and Alzheimer's is the most common. And so it's the firstborn son. There's more people who have Alzheimer's as opposed to vascular dementia, or frontotemporal dementia, or Lewy body dementia, and I'll refer to those a little bit later on. And then there's other kinds. But there's 70 to 80 different kinds of dementia where a person has problems with their thinking, the ability to do ADL, activities of daily living. We talk about that in nursing homes. Alzheimer's disease that especially deals with short-term memory loss is the most common or prevalent. So thank you for asking that question, and feel free to ask other questions as the case may be. There's three components that enter into the idea of a family having Alzheimer's within their own life. Number one, is there a family history? In other words, are there folks in your family that have it? Number two, what's the age of those family members that acquired that? At what time in their life? Was it later in life? Was it early in life? Early onset dementia is anything 65 and younger. Yes, sir. Alzheimer's is in the left portion of the hippocampus, which stores short-term memory loss. And short-term memory loss is anything from 20 seconds to 5 minutes. Have you had family members sometimes that will tell you the same thing over and over and over again? Either that's a combination of having Alzheimer's, or else there are some other things going on where they just can't comprehend. It's not that they're trying to be obstinate and just be aggravating. It's they literally can't remember the things that you just talked about because that has been fried, for lack of a better word. It's just been taken away. And so Alzheimer's, or Alzheimer's, however you want to say it, affects activities of daily living later on in its course. The median for this disease is 6.5 to 8 years. Now, there's some people who've had it for longer. My mom died after 39 months, 3 years and 3 months. But it does affect your thinking and your ability to do things. Other disease, such as vascular dementia, is where there's strokes and hardening of the arteries, if you will, blood flow, the constriction within the body, which causes other issues. And it's typically shorter in regards to maybe 3 to 4 years in length before a person dies. A person becomes very resistant because blood flow is causing them not to think clearly, and therefore they may say things and do things. Frontotemporal dementia, especially in men, is where their body becomes very rigid and they have a lot of difficulties in speech and in making decisions. Frontotemporal happens to a lot of younger people where they begin to act out in strange ways. They will pull their hair. They eventually get to the point where they cannot turn their head but just have to go straight. And there's a lot of issues with that. Again, there's only about 1 to 2% of people who have frontotemporal dementia. Frontotemporal talks about portions of the brain itself. So all of this has to do with the different forms. And then there's Lewy body dementia. Lewy body dementia is where, again, it affects a person's movements physically, but also mentally as well. Robin Williams, the comedian, died of Lewy body dementia and ultimately took his life in that manner. Back to the idea of the three ideas, three thoughts concerning the potential of someone having Alzheimer's. Family history, the age that they required or acquired that disease. Anything 65 and younger is called early onset dementia. About 200,000 people in America have early onset dementia where it happened before 65. And then thirdly, how close were you to the family members who had that Alzheimer's? Is it a third cousin? Is it a parent? If it's a parent, then there are greater chances that it might be something that you're going to have to look at. Here's the research. They did a 6-year study. Brigham Young University, the University of Utah, Utah State University, studied the Utah population database. They went back to the 1800s for genealogical data for at least 12 generations or 12 ancestors in 3 generations. They studied 270,000 different family members. And what they were looking for was what they called first-degree relatives, parents, children, and siblings. Then they looked at second-degree relatives, grandparents, grandchildren, aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews. Then they looked at third-degree relatives, great-grandparents, great-grandchildren, grandnieces and grandnephews, great-aunts and great-uncles. And then what they did was they looked at the potential risk of family members today having that disease based upon their genealogy. And this is what they found. If you had someone in the first-degree relatives, that is parents, children, or siblings that have the disease, you are 1.73 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. People who had 2 first-degree relatives, let's say a parent and a sister, were 4 times more likely to develop the disease. Those who had 4 first-degree relatives that had dementia, 2 parents and 2 siblings, almost 15 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. So, in your own situation, think about who has it, what relationship, when did they acquire it. The younger, possibly the more susceptible it might be in you. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. One thing that I'm hanging my hat on, even with Mom having it, is that a study was done, children of a mother who lived beyond 85. Mom died at 86. And a father above the age of 83. My dad died at 92. Who did not acquire the disease in those ages, 85 or above the age of 83. Though their children, me, my brother, my sister, have a 40% less chance of showing signs of cognitive impairment between the ages of 65 to 79. So Mom did acquire it, but it was late in life. And she lived beyond the age of 85. She was 87 when she died. So having an older parents not having this disease gives a greater chance that their children are not going to have it, at least 40% less. Does that make sense? So the older it is before a person acquires it helps in terms of their family, the family behind in regards to that. Let's go to number 4 now. With Alzheimer's, short-term memory is often affected before long-term memory. That's very, very true. Clinicians count short-term memory as anything that happened from 20 seconds to 5 minutes ago. And so a person may or may not be able to remember those things. Number 5. The caregiver needs to feed the Alzheimer's patient since aspiration can occur if they do not. The answer there is false. That when they are feeding themselves, there's 3 times greater the chance of choking by them feeding themselves. Or are you feeding them? I'm sorry. You feeding them as opposed to them feeding themselves. Some folks can't feed themselves, and so you have to feed them. But if they can feed themselves, let them do so. Eat with them. Put food on red plates. There's something about the color of red that pulls people's idea and attention to the idea of wanting to eat. And they may desire to eat more in that regard. Now, there may be a time again when you have to feed them, or you're trying to hurry up, and whatever the case may be. Aspiration, choking can occur because they're still trying to process the food, and you may not see that because it's not in your mouth. And so it's really helpful, if at all possible, to allow them to feed themselves and you eat with them as you can. Number 6. Next. Head trauma is the leading cause for dementia among young adults. It's very true. Each year, 200,000 end up in the hospital due to head injuries, sports, motorcycle crashes, post-concussion. Post-concussion that is repeated can cause apathy and forgetfulness. Every 20 seconds, a traumatic brain injury occurs in America. The signs can include headache, confusion, blurred vision, memory loss. 9.5% of all dementia situations can be attributed to one head injury. And they're the most common cause for dementia in teens. So it's very important to wear those helmets and to be careful about the things that you do. Number 7, next. 13% of all people at the age of 65 will develop Alzheimer's disease. That's true. 13%. There's 6.9 million people in America as of August of last year that have Alzheimer's. It's been every 68 seconds someone in America develops Alzheimer's disease. It's been estimated by the year 2060, it will be every 33 seconds, and it'll be like 13.8 million people that will deal with this. So now think about people within your congregation. Think about the number of folks 65 and older. 13% of them are going to have to deal with this disease. You reach the age of 85, and it's also almost 47% of people 85 and older that acquire dementia. 44% of people in assisted living have the disease known as dementia in America. And so it is something that doesn't have to happen, but as a person gets older, it can be more a part of it. Number 8, next. With dementia, there's a direct connection to the loss of neurons in the brain to this disease. Very true. These neurons are like nerve cells, computer chips within the brain. They send brain signals to each other. They're called synapses. In time, they short circuit because these cells don't work together. And some have said we have as many as 100 billion nerve cells within our brain. But as we get older, in our late 40s or early 50s, we lose one every second. So that's 86,400 a day brain cells that we lose. But now do the math, and when you've got 100 billion, you don't have to live probably beyond the age of 100 before it really begins to kick in, okay? So just don't think about, oh no, I've got dementia, I've lost 86,400 today. Well, no, you've got 100 billion, so you're good. When Alzheimer's destroys these cells, they cannot be reproduced because there's a protein called tau or plaque that clogs them up. We'll look at some pictures here in just a few minutes of diseased brain cells that you can see the difference between a healthy brain and this kind. Yes? I don't think so. I think it's different because of the brain versus there. But no, ma'am, I believe that's a different type of plaque. Tau is T-A-U, and that's the stuff. It's a protein. Yes, sir. I'm not a doctor, but I would suggest just because of the stroke doesn't necessarily mean that has to be the case. You know, a stroke can be caused because of restriction of blood in the vessels, right? And so when they, put in that stent or do other things, that can open all that up and that can take care of that. So it may be a short-term something or another, but it has to be long-term. With some, I guess if it's something that's continual, then that might be an issue. But again, doctors would be better able to deal with that versus the other. Number 9, feeding tubes can be of great help to an Alzheimer's patient, adding weight and nutritional balance to their body. I'm not a doctor, but for the most part, that answer is false. Think about a feeding tube. First of all, it's a surgery. That means that you have to go into a place you've never been before. And a lot of times you may know of older people who have problems in the ICU area because it's just a strange environment. They don't see family. They're not able to see family for very long. And all these tubes and all these machines and it's just a strange situation. Also, feeding tubes is something that can fall out and you have to put it back in. So that means another part of a surgery. It does not reduce the risk of pneumonia. Sometimes there's a lot of swelling due to the surgery. Sometimes even with a feeding tube, an Alzheimer's patient, they'll spit up the food that comes through the feeding tube. But it also, just from a personal point of view, takes away the human contact of feeding and tasting favorite foods. Maybe a daughter now needs to feed her mother, but she's able to talk to her as they do so, and that human contact it goes. And so studies have shown that in most cases, a feeding tube with a dementia patient isn't beneficial. It doesn't continue life in a long, long way. Again, that's doctors' decisions and yours as well. Finally, number 10. To an Alzheimer's patient, a black rubber mat is often perceived as a hole and they will not step on it. That's true. With the disease of dementia, especially Alzheimer's, depth perception is distorted. They can see, but they can't see like they once did. And as dementia continues its terrible journey in a person's life, eventually dementia patients can only go in one direction, straight ahead. And so it's important, if you have family members who have that their bedroom or their bathroom be where they don't have to turn, because sometimes they can't. Again, if you have certain parts of the disease of dementia, they can't turn their head. and therefore they can only walk straight. Dr. David Hutchings, the fellow that I said owns land over in Tupelo, Mississippi, a farmer, but has dementia units up in Boston, talked about an advanced dementia unit they had where this lady kept on getting out. Even though there were alarms on the doors, she'd go out late at night to 7-Eleven to buy her cigarettes. Of course, they didn't want her smoking, but they also didn't want her to fall or to get hurt. And they were doing everything, and she was just still escaping. Somebody said, let's put one of those big rubber mats there at the door, that you wipe your feet on. She thought it was a hole, and she wouldn't step over it. And so that just kept her in. Something strange like that happened. All right, with that idea in mind, let's look at some facts and figures concerning dementia. The next handout. There's 6.9 million Americans that are afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. 120,000 people die each year. It's the 6th leading cause of death in America presently. I'm talking about Alzheimer's. And the 5th leading cause of death for folks 65 and older. We mentioned the idea that 13% of people over the age of 65 and 48% have dementia. In America, every hour, 330 people turn 65. That's 8,000 a day. And so think about the ramifications of that. By the year 2030, 1 out of 4 Americans will be 65 or older. Think about your church here. How many people do you have from 65 to 95? Alzheimer's disease affects women more than men. Typically, 2/3 of those who have Alzheimer's are women. Yet they're often the primary caregivers for people with Alzheimer's. And so it affects women more than it does men. The word dementia is a Latin word meaning out of mind. That's what the word means. It's the permanent loss of multiple intellectual functions. It's like a computer where the hard drive has crashed, the files are there, but they can't be pulled up. Let's look at some of the things about that. The next slide, please. The loss of memory. The hippocampus. It attacks that portion of the brain. You see the confusion sometimes. A person having contorted face because they're trying to understand. With dementia, there's also problems with speech and understanding. A question that we don't need to ask dementia patients, our loved ones, is, do you know who I am? Because you know what? It's going to take them 7 seconds for them to process those words. Do they really, do you know who I am? They're trying to think about, what do you mean by that question? So what you need to do with a dementia patient is, hey, John, I'm Don Williams. Boy, it's so good to see you. You see, I've done 2 things. I've told them who they are, in case they've forgotten. But more importantly, I've told them who I am. I'm sure you've heard the old joke about the older preacher that went in to visit a lady at the nursing home and walked up to her, and she's sitting there in a wheelchair and said, Sister Smith, do you know who I am? And the lady said, no, but if you'll see that lady in the white dress, she'll tell you who you are. You tell them who you are. You even mention them by name. That takes the pressure off in that regard. There's also changes in personality and behavior. Without oversimplifying it, dementia people either get bitter or better in most cases. People who are friendly and kind sometimes turn the other way. Folks that were sometimes hard in early life get better. You even know sometimes situations where folks become hostile. You ever known someone who was a child of God who begins to curse and say things that they ought not to? Why? Inhibitory circuits that are in the right side of the brain that serve as governors to hold back us from saying things that we ought not to, or the words that would be profaned, has been damaged by the dementia. And therefore there's no governor to hold them back. You know, imagine a go-kart that's supposed to go 20 miles an hour, but you take the governor off and it goes 60 miles an hour. That can be dangerous. The kids enjoy that, but that can be dangerous. Same way is true with a person. It's not because they're being obstinate. It's not that they're sowing their wild oats in their latter years of life. The disease has damaged their brain to the point that there's nothing to hold them back. And so we need to keep in mind, dementia is a disease of the brain. It is not a disease of the soul. Please remember that. It's a disease of the soul, not of the brain, not of the soul. It's not that they're trying to do this. The disease takes away that. There's increased reliance on others for activities of daily living. Let's look at some pictures now. Next slide. There's a picture of the normal brain on the left side. You see the shrunken size of the other brain. These came from down in Tuscaloosa. I don't know if that group is still the same as it used to be, but there's an 800 number if you want to try to call them in that regard. Next, amnesia. There's those three different, the memory function. In the early stages of Alzheimer's and amnesia, they forget little details. They misplace things. They write notes as reminders. They realize that they have memory problems and they try to cover it up. My mother-in-law, who had this for 8 years, somebody would ask her the question and she said, "Oh, you know what that question is, John?" And she'd deflect to my father-in-law to answer it. She didn't know the answer, but she didn't want them to know that she didn't know the answer. So she'd deflect it. "Well, you know what that is, John, tell her." You know, that type of thing. In the middle stages of amnesia, and again, you can see normal versus the Alzheimer's on the right-hand side. They forget phone calls, location of their purse, medication, hundreds of daily details. They forget the past. They forget that they can't remember, they argue about it. They need help with financial items. Finally, in the end of amnesia, they forget past or recent events. And finally, their memory is completely blank. The next one, aphasia. Aphasia is the ability to understand the spoken or written word. Remember that question? Who am I? It takes them 72% longer to understand what you are asking. They'll often repeat the same words that you just said. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Because they're trying to process what that actually means. And again, you see the brains and how it begins to shrink greater and greater and greater with that inability to understand the spoken or written word. The next one is apraxia. Apraxia is a loss of ability to perform remembered motor task. Changing your clothes. You ever notice that they wear the same clothes over and over again? We noticed that whenever my mother-in-law would come to visit us, and it wouldn't be that many times, she'd wear the same blue pants, white silk shirt, and red and white little coat. Now maybe it was comfortable, but every time, the times they would come to visit, that's what she had on. If my father-in-law was 20 feet away and not in the same room, she really had a hard problem. Where's John? Where's John? Where's John? Again, he was the focal point. And there's typically some focal point, one person that's their point of focus that they want to keep their eyes on because they remember them or they know that that person is going to help them. Activities of daily living, not knowing how to button a shirt or to shave or even how to use the bathroom. And then finally, agnosia, the last one, where they can't remember what things look like or feel like or who someone is. This disease destroys the brain cells. It spares vision, but they see, but they can't recognize. And it also involves the idea of sundowning. Next picture. Sundowning is where a person sleeps in the day and stays up at night. Well, you've been working all day long, or you've been staying with them all day long. You're ready for a nap. You're ready to sleep. They're ready to get up, and that's where they wander around. Again, it's not because they're being obstinate. See the hole in that brain? They just don't have the ability. It's all not there to be able to take care of them, to provide for them. And so they're going to stay up because they think it's time to stay up, even though it's nighttime and most people are asleep. Sundowning goes along with that, and they begin to get sometimes agitated at night because they need to sleep, but they're not. And so you see some pictures there. Alzheimer's is the most common form, 60% to 70%. Again, if dementia is the last name, Alzheimer's is the firstborn son. It's most prevalent of all the kinds of the dementia. Lewy body is where Parkinson's disease is part of it. It's more in men than it is women. They become very rigid. They have problems in solving situations. Vascular dementia is the second most common form of dementia. A lot of intellectual losses, up and down mood swings. A preacher friend of mine told me when we were talking about this one time when I was speaking on this subject at Polishing the Pulpit, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, my dad, you would look at him and you would think, he's not harmful, but said he has vascular dementia. And when that blood flow or the lack of blood flow constricts things, he becomes obstinate. And one day when he was in the hospital and he was standing up, he got so mad at what the doctor was telling him that he kicked the metal bed and put a dent in it. And we knew then and there that he could no longer be in the same home with our mom. We had to find a place for him to be, because if he was that mad, not knowing what he was doing, he could hurt her if he kicked her or hit her in some way. Frontotemporal dementia, only about 1% to 2% have that. It's extremely progressive. Social and language problems. A lot of young people have it. They're out of control. They often use bad language, make inappropriate social decisions. They have narrow vision. They're pulling their hair. Again, only about 1% to 2% have that problem. I believe that's the last slide. But I want to end with this, and then we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to talk about tips for helping people with the onset of dementia. Again, these are like 2 of 10 different classes that we could do on this, so we're just sort of starting it out with the idea of this. The trauma of Alzheimer's. When we think about trauma, we think about blunt force that causes pain to the body or that brings forth mental or physical pain. These are real statements. 2009, honey, will you please talk to your mother? She thought the soap was out of her hair as she washed it in the sink. It was not, and I went to help her. She hit at me and fell backwards and hit the ground. Now she thinks I pushed her and meant to do it. I'm afraid she'll tell others that I pushed her. A husband talking about his wife. A husband of 42 years of marriage tells this horror story. My wife had regularly colored her hair. In an effort to preserve something that would be familiar to her, I did it for her. One time she became combative and would not allow me to rinse out the color. As it began to burn her scalp, she became more agitated and screamed. And he said at the end of all of this, with no one there to help us, both of us were crying and sobbing. I had lost her and myself along the way. Those are some of the sad, sad stories of this illness that we have to think about. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back and talk about the tips that we can do once a person certainly has that diagnosis of the disease. And so let's take about another 5 to 10 minutes. I understand that they have taken all the calories out of those donuts over on the left side, so feel free to get you one of those. And again, thank you so much for coming, and we'll start back in about 8 minutes. Thank you.